name is Amanda Roper. I'm manager of interpretation at the Lee-Fendall House Museum. Welcome back. This afternoon we're actually out here in the garden to talk about a little bit of the tour that we offer called Under the Same Roof. This tour we started offering 3 years ago, and it explores the lives and experiences of the enslaved and free African Americans who lived and worked on this property throughout its history. The Lee-Fendall House Museum, like many museums that opened up in the 1970s, for so long, half of the story was not being told. And we have done a lot of research in more recent years to try to uncover the lives of the people who built this house, the people who left their mark here in so many ways. And you really cannot tell the story of this site without the story of the people who worked here, enslaved and free African Americans over the years. So today we're going to be highlighting stories of the house that try to tell a fuller picture of the whole house's history. And we're standing out here in the garden today to talk a little bit about how this space has changed a lot over the years. The house, when it was built in 1785, this back area would have been very much a working yard. And we think the first structure actually that was built on the property would have been the two-story dwelling house that would have been against the back part of the lot. This dwelling house most likely housed some of the enslaved African Americans who built the main house in the 1780s. And we know from tax records that Philip Fendall, who owned the house, he was enslaving 51 men, women, and children of African descent in Alexandria in that year alone. Now, many of them, like I said, were probably working to build the house. Others were working at his nearby properties, which included a blacksmith shop, a sawmill, and a nearby farm. Now we know that by the time the house is completed, there are also a large number of people who are working here as domestic servants, and they're doing the work of keeping this house running. And some of the jobs that they were doing were certainly taking place here in the yard. We know that in addition to this two-story dwelling house, there was also a variety of gardens here on the property, most likely an herb garden and a kitchen garden for growing food. Also in the far back corner there would have been a rabbit warren and a pigeon house. So they're also raising these small animals for consumption here. When you look at the main house, you can see also that this house, being a telescope house, the kitchen was always attached, and above the kitchen would have been additional sleeping quarters for the enslaved people who would have been working here in the house. So we're standing here in the main hallway of the Lee-Fendall House, and going back to when this house was built in the 1780s, we know there were many skilled enslaved craftsmen who definitely literally left their mark on this place. Fendall enslaved a very skilled, at least one very skilled carpenter, and you can see this beautiful archway and crown molding here in the hallways, all original to when the house was built. And all this work just beautifully done by hand. This house was quite unique when it was designed, in that it was a wooden house. It wasn't brick like many of the other homes in Alexandria, but to help minimize the risk of fire, when they built the home, they did actually stuff a level layer of bricks inside the interior walls. So as we move to the back part of the hallway, you'll be able to see some of these bricks. And when this house was built in the 1780s, it was part of a large building boom that was taking place here in Alexandria following the Revolutionary War. And so many people were building homes and shops here in Alexandria. And there were several large brick manufactories right here in town. And they were producing a lot of the bricks that you see that we used to build this city. And brick making during this time period was very much a process that was done by hand. And we know that when we discovered parts of bricks, old bricks, in the back garden from some of the structures that were torn down, we found it was not uncommon to find finger marks, indentations in the bricks where enslaved craftsmen who were making these bricks by hand had left, again, quite literally left their mark. And that's a very personal, very tangible connection to the people, many of whose names we do not know, who built this city and who built this house. So we're standing here in one of the parlor rooms on the first floor of the home, and we talk about in this room the time period shortly after the home was built, during that federal period of history. And the Fendall family, when they lived here in the home initially, they were very wealthy. They were making a lot of money from shipping here in Alexandria and real estate, and they were very close friends with all of the large families in the area, of course being related to the Lee family, but also very close to the Washington family also. But when the Fendalls, by the time of 1805, when Philip Fendall passes away, there had been an economic downturn in the country, and he had made a series of bad investments also. So when he passes away in 1805, he leaves his widow Mary Lee and their two kids with a smaller income than they were accustomed to. Mary Lee Fendall basically ends up racking up even more personal debts here in town, and she's struggling with these debts for the remainder of her life until she passes away in 1827. And these financial struggles for the Fendall family had a very profound impact, a very tragic impact on the people that were enslaved here in the household. The first time we know the names of people that were enslaved here in the house comes from Philip Fendall's will in 1805. And like I said, for so long these names were not spoken on the tour, but on our tours we do like to speak these names aloud, to read them in this space where they would have worked, where they would have lived. And so I'm going to read their names today. Ned was a carpenter here, and his wife Beek. Jerry was a coachman, and his wife Nellie. Henry, also a coachman, his wife Betsy, and their 3-year-old child Anne. Mary and her children, Nellie, Bill, Celia, Tom. Letty and her son Andrew, and Julia. And you can tell from the list that a third of the people here in 1805, they were children. These were families. And as Mary Lee Fendall is defaulting on her payments and her debts are growing, she ends up mortgaging and eventually selling off many of the people that were enslaved here on the property. These families are being torn apart during this time period. So it's a very tragic period, certainly in this house's history. We know that for some of the people that were enslaved by the Fendalls during this time, they decide to risk everything. They decide to actually attempt to run away and find freedom elsewhere, most of the time running further north towards Baltimore and Philadelphia. And we actually know from a runaway slave ad that was posted by the Fendalls in 1808, that a young man named Ben, who was enslaved by the family, decided to run away on Christmas Day of 1808. He was 21 years old. He had actually been working as a gardener for the Fendalls before, due to financial difficulties, Mary Lee Fendall decides to rent him out. He's being rented out at a sugar refinery here in Alexandria, and that was very dangerous work. It was also very, very difficult manual work. In addition to that, Ben, who probably had family nearby, did not know what his fate might be. It was very common throughout the early 1800s, increasingly so, that people were being sold from Virginia to the deep south, plantations further south that were starting to grow cotton. And so for many of them, they may have actually ended up very far away, not only from their loved ones, but from their community here in Alexandria. So for whatever reason, we don't know, but Ben does decide to make that escape attempt in 1808. We don't know what happens to him, but we know that it was a decision that he made for himself in a time where many people, of course, were trying to make his life decisions for him. And this story is just, to me, a very powerful story of the people who, despite their circumstances here, were working to self-liberate themselves from the system of slavery. But the Lee and Fendall family, we know that they continue to reside here in the house in the period leading up to the Civil War. And we're actually going to talk about that period in the 1850s in the next room. In 1850, the Lee-Fendall House was purchased by the couple whose portraits you see above the piano here in the front parlor, Louis Cazenove and Harriet. Harriet was a member of the Lee family, so the house was still, like I said, in Lee family hands in the years leading up to the outbreak of the American Civil War. Now the Cazanos, when they bought the house in 1850, they did renovate it quite extensively, changing the architectural, many of the architectural features of the house, and also upgrading many of the interior features, including adding things like gas lighting and coal furnace for heating. They are also installing in the 1850s a series of call bells. So in each room of the main house, there are one of these, you can still see today, one of these porcelain call levers. They were each one wired to a corresponding call bell in the kitchen, and they were utilized to call the enslaved and free servants that were working here in the house to the main rooms here. Now we know that the Cazanos, they were enslaving a young couple by the name of Phil and Marie, both of them in their early 20s. Phil and Marie were working as a houseman and a cook here, but in addition to these two people, we also know the name of another woman who was working here in the house in the 1850s. Her name was Malvina Harris. Malvina Harris was a free woman, listed on the 1850 census as living here, most likely working as a child nurse for the Cazanos. Louis Cazenove had two daughters from a previous marriage that she was most likely responsible for. Malvina Harris was 30 years old. We know that from the census. She did not know how to read or write. And many people find it surprising when they come on a tour here to hear Malvina's story. They wonder why a woman like her, who was free, would work in a household alongside people who were enslaved. And there are so many different reasons that this might have been. We don't know, but Malvina certainly would have had limited options for employment, even as a free person here in Alexandria, not knowing how to read or write, and being a woman, she would have had very limited avenues for employment. It is possible too that she had family ties, either in this house or close by, people who were perhaps even still in slavery, that she wanted to make sure she was close. And increasingly so in this time period in the 1850s, particularly after the 1850 compromise, you were starting to see Alexandria become really a very central hub for the domestic slave trade. And many of these slave traders, they were going so far as to capture people who were free and selling them into slavery. And so for people like Malvina, it was possible that being attached to one of the wealthiest families here in Alexandria offered a degree of protection from that very real threat here. And of course in 1850, you have a bunch of things going on, but DC does end its slave sales as part of the 1850 compromise. So again, Alexandria became really a major hub for selling people, again, from Virginia to places further south. And so again, stories of many people who were being separated from their families and from their communities here in Alexandria. But when the Civil War breaks out here in 1861, Alexandria obviously was a very southern city, was very Confederate, and they vote by a huge majority to separate from the Union. But literally the day after they vote to leave the Union, you have federal soldiers marching into Alexandria. And so Alexandria is positioned as one of the first southern cities to come under federal control. And because of that, you have many African Americans who come to Alexandria seeking freedom. So they're coming to Union lines, and they are looking to experience freedom for the first time. And while that's a very hopeful story and a very heartwarming story, unfortunately there's also an element of tragedy in that story as well. Many of the people who find themselves coming here, really refugees, are living in makeshift camps. There's just not enough food, not enough shelter for many of them. And while some find work with the federal soldiers and here in Alexandria, many are dying of disease and starvation in those first few months of freedom. This house would have played a role in sort of that health crisis that's taking place here during the Civil War. It was actually a Union Army hospital, and it was where they were doing a lot of sort of the more advanced medical procedures. One of the sort of groundbreaking procedures that we know takes place here, the first documented and successful blood transfusion of the Civil War takes place here in 1864. So This house was converted into a Union hospital, and it was seized because it was considered, of course, enemy property. And so this house very much playing a role in those years of the Civil War. So we're standing here in the location of the original kitchen in the house. I mentioned earlier, unlike many homes in the 18th century, this kitchen was always connected to the main home, and the living quarters above were always part of the property as well. So, like I said, when the museum opened in the 1970s, they were literally telling they were cutting out half of the story of the people who lived under this roof. They're all living under the same roof here in very close proximity, so you really cannot separate these lives from one another. And you can see here on the back wall of the kitchen this call bell system that was installed in the 1850s. I pointed out the porcelain levers earlier in the main rooms of the house. These were the corresponding call bells. Each bell was a different size, and therefore it was a different tone. So the people that were working in this part of the house, at this end of the house, knew by listening which room they were being called to. And when I think of these bells, I think about the fact that they would have been heard by the people that were enslaved in this house prior to the Civil War. So I'm going to ring the first two bells today manually. The wires have long been cut, but I just want to take a moment for us to listen to the sound of these bells. So off of the kitchen here, you can see this very narrow set of back stairs. Original to the house, it would have been the steps that were used by the enslaved and free African Americans here in the house's history to navigate between the floors. It is, like I mentioned, very, very narrow. It is very steep. And we're going to make our way up to see some of the spaces above the kitchen that would have been living quarters from the 1850s onwards. So you can see the space here at the top of the stairs above the kitchen. Again, it would have been living quarters. These rooms were divided into more private spaces in the 1850s. But then, the area, you can really feel the confined nature of the space. I sort of refer to it as sort of the architecture of control. It is very cramped. It is very dark. It's very much lower feeling ceilings than in the main part of the house. And what I think is one of the most poignant things to see in this space is the set of back stairs, which is uncovered and is so worn. You can see the generations of footsteps that made their way up to the main part of the house, utilizing this set of back stairs. So we're standing here in one of the main bedrooms here back in the main part of the house, and you can feel the space here. They're very, very spacious bedrooms for a home that was built in the 1780s. And this bedroom, we talk about what happens to the house in the years following the Civil War. I mentioned there was a large number of African Americans who come to Alexandria during the Civil War. They're seeking freedom and opportunity here, and many of them come with a great sense of hope. To them, freedom is the ability to protect their families. It's the ability to own something of their own. It's the ability to be able to move places wherever you want without being told that you can. So freedom is a very important thing for the people that are here following the war. And initially there is this sense of hope. In the Reconstruction period, many of the local radical Republicans, as they were known, the political leaders here in Alexandria, were working with members of the African American community to bring about voting rights, schools, and housing for this large community that found their home here. And we know that this house, immediately after the war was over, was actually being lived in by a couple of these politicians, these radical Republicans, who are working to bring about a new system of government in Virginia, one that is more welcoming to the newly freed people here in the state. So it's sort of an interesting period of time where it is actually still a Lee family home. It is actually being rented out to these Reconstruction officials here, and it's really, to me, this house illustrates what's happening in Alexandria, that you have all of these different people groups who in many ways have very different visions for the future of Alexandria. Of course, the African American population here, they're trying to enjoy their newfound freedoms and their rights as citizens as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed. You also have many Union soldiers who are still here during Reconstruction. They are trying to enforce the laws of this new government that's being worked out by both African American and white politicians. But many of these returning ex-Confederate families they have a different vision for their city. They wanted in many ways to go back to the way that it was before the war. And as Reconstruction is eventually rolled back in places like Virginia and across the South by the 1870s, you're actually having the return to power of a lot of the families that were in power here in Alexandria before the war. So there is this power struggle really taking place here in the city, and that is playing out here in this, even in this home. By 1870, the house has actually been purchased and returned to, once again, to the Lee family. So Dr. Robert Fleming and his wife Mary Lee Fleming, they purchased the home, and they and their extended family, who are also members of the Lee family here, they continue to live in this house until 1903. And when they are here, they are employing a number of African Americans, mostly women. So when freedom comes and as the Reconstruction era comes to an end and the era of Jim Crow is ushered in, many women in the African American community are finding themselves with very limited opportunities for employment. And many are finding themselves returning to work in homes that they had been working in before the war. And we have a couple of names of women who were working here in this house during that post-war period. One of them was Malvina Price. Malvina Price was working for the Flemings as a child nurse. There were 6 children, Fleming children, who were living here in the home by 1870. And the job of Malvina Price was to be a child nurse to the younger children here in the household. The children would have been staying in the bedrooms on the 3rd floor of the house at that time. And there is a small room that possibly was being utilized as a nursery or a room for Malvina, the child nurse. We also have the name of Carrie Peterson. She was working as a chambermaid here in the house in 1880. She had been born and was a child during slavery, but she started working here for the Fleming family again after that Civil War, that post-war period. And she had the job of keeping the house clean, washing linens. One of her tasks also would be emptying the chamber pot, which would have been, this is actually an authentic piece that was discovered during excavations in the backyard of the property. It was pieced together. It had probably been broken and tossed out, possibly going up and down those back stairs. But it is very much a piece that, again, it provides that tangible connection with the people that were here before. So we're standing here in another bedroom here on the 2nd level. This bedroom interprets the time period in the house here around the turn of the 20th century. And so we know that by 1903, the house was purchased for the first time by a prominent family who were not connected to the Lees. So the house was actually purchased by Robert Downham as a gift for his new bride, May Greenwell Downham. And Robert Downham was one of the city's largest and most successful liquor dealers. So he was very popular and also very wealthy. So that's why he was buying this house here by the early 1900s. We know that the Downham family, they do not record the names of the people that are working here for them, but they talk about 2 sisters from North Carolina who end up moving up here to work in this home here in Alexandria. And these sisters had grown up in a very rural part of North Carolina. They were part of this great migration of African Americans that we see making their way usually north to larger cities and are looking for employment opportunities, and oftentimes they're finding employment in homes of some of the wealthy families that are living in this DC area. And we also know that there was a gentleman who was working as a houseman here as well. So they were most likely living and working in this house while the Downham family were residing here. The Downham family, similar to the Fendall family who originally owned the house, faced a series of financial hardships, starting with the passage of Prohibition here in Virginia in 1916, being liquor dealers that severely limited their business income. They were forced to find new avenues of revenue, but were never really very successful in doing that. So by the time the stock market crashes in 1929, the Downham family are looking to downsize to a smaller property. Robert Downham wrote and complained, like many of the families, wealthy families here in Alexandria at the time, that part of the reason he was also downsizing was because it was getting harder and harder to find people to work in their homes. And this is part of a movement among the younger generation of African Americans here in Alexandria in the 1920s and 1930s. They simply they don't want to work in the houses like their parents had done. They were looking for new opportunities, working in the shops, the local businesses that were thriving here in Alexandria at the time. And we do have, of course, our very early library sit-in here in the 1930s. So they are part of this generation that are really pushing for change. They want a new life, a different life for themselves than the one their parents had had. So there's all of this going on here, which is part of the reason that this house is sold by the Downham family. They mentioned in building their new home that it was designed in a modern way where you are not relying on servants to run the household as much. We do not have, unfortunately, the names or photos of the people who were working here for the Downhams in the early 1900s, but we do have a photograph of one of the women who was working for Robert Downham's sister, Maud Downham. Her name was Louisa. And we actually have this photo here showing Louisa in the garden of the Lee-Fendall House during a visit. And she was the child nurse for Maud Downham and their son, Ben. Here he's pictured. And this picture to me, it shows that the Downham family, they didn't, she was not the focal point of the photo. In many ways, they saw her and yet they did not see her. And this is the only photograph that we have been able to find from this period that depicts the people who were, feeding their children, cooking the meals, and again, keeping this house running. We're standing here in the final room of the tour, in a room that talks about the last resident owners of the house, the Lewis family. John L. Lewis, one of the nation's most powerful and most controversial labor leaders in the 20th century. He was head of the nation's largest union in the 1930s when he's moving here. He's head of the United Mine Workers Union, the coal miners union. A very powerful man working very closely in DC with the president and various members of Congress. He was working to protect the rights of workers. Coal miners were near and dear to his heart, but he also worked to organize other unskilled laborers, auto workers, electronic workers during this time period. And he certainly left a very interesting legacy. Like I said, he did a lot to improve working conditions for American workers, but was always a bit controversial. And he was certainly everywhere in the press in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But the story of John L. Lewis is not the story that I want to end this tour with today. It's actually the story of another man by the name of James Lewis. And we're going to walk over here and learn about his story. In 1941, James Lewis, a young African-American gentleman from Alexandria, responded to a newspaper advertisement to work as a chauffeur for John L. Lewis. James Lewis was basically started out working as a chauffeur, but ended up becoming a steward for the household, as well as a personal assistant to John L. Lewis. The friendship between these two men is an interesting story. They both had left school at an early age to work, But while John L. Lewis was able to rise to become president of one of the most powerful unions in the country, James Lewis, of course, is growing up in the era of segregation and Jim Crow. So his opportunities were always more limited, but his drive to succeed and to provide for his family was really limitless. He went on to work not only for John L. Lewis, but most of the 20th century United Mine Workers presidents that followed Lewis. And James Lewis was able to provide for his family. All of his children went on to receive degrees in higher education. And it was all through his hard work. He was able to teach himself really how to keep meticulous records for the household, and became a very close confidant, I said, to John L. Lewis when he was here up until his death in 1969. We were very lucky to have some of James Lewis's children come and visit the museum a couple of years ago, and they brought with them these wonderful photographs, postcards, letters, exchanged between the two men. It really gave us a bigger picture, a fuller picture of their lives, particularly the life of James Lewis, and how hard he worked to overcome prejudice and discrimination in order to provide a better future for himself and for his family. And that's a story I like to end the tour with today. A reminder that for the people who were enslaved here, who worked here in this house over the years, the story is ultimately their story of strength, of resilience, and of hope. But thank you for joining us, and I hope that you'll join us. We are able to offer this tour again in person. We are at this point hoping to be able to offer the tour under the same roof at the end of the month, July 25th, which is a Saturday, afternoon at 2 p.m. We are going to have a very limited number of people on this tour due to the coronavirus restrictions, so we will be posting that link on our website. So if you're interested in signing up for that tour and hearing more of these stories, please do so. Our website is www.leefendallhouse.org, and I hope to see you then.